How do you make one of the greatest psychedelic albums of the 60s and not stick around long enough to see it become a hit? And how do you release your biggest ever album with a typo on the cover? Well, the Zombies can tell you. Today we're having a look at Odessey and Oracle, the Zombies' 1968 cult masterpiece that rose from obscurity to become one of the most beloved albums in rock history. And as always, if you're into rock history and deep dives, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and join our pack. Okay, a bit of Zombies history first. In 1967, things weren't going so well for them. They'd started out well enough, forming in 61 from some jam sessions. Keyboardist Rod Argent recalls that they met outside a pub before they were even old enough to get in, and they found their singer inside the pub. I was literally in a corner singing to myself, doing a Ricky Nelson song, and Rod came over and said, "That's really good. I'll tell you what, if you'll be the lead singer, I'll play keyboards." Things continued, and in 1964 they got their first big hit with She's Not There.
Well, no one told me about her, the way she lied.
They followed that up with another hit, Tell Her No, in 1965.
Tell her no, 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 no.
By this time they had a decent following, things were going well, but by 66 they were running on fumes. The hits weren't hitting, performances were starting to dry up, and their label, Decca Records, were losing faith and interest. And of course it didn't help that they had a wealth of competition in their prime. Remember, they were up against the likes of 1960s Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and The Who, to name just a few. So the Zombies decided to nip things in the bud and left Decca Records, signing instead with CBS, with one condition. They wanted to produce their next album themselves. They wanted complete artistic freedom. According to the band, they felt like if they were going to break up, which looked very possible at this point, they wanted to make an album that was completely theirs. The label agreed, and they went to Abbey Road Studios to make what would end up being their swan song, Odessey and Oracle. This is the same Abbey Road, of course, where the Beatles created some of their best ever works. In fact, they had just recorded Sgt. Pepper there, just 2 months before. Rod Argent reportedly even used John Lennon's keyboard. They were also fortunate enough to be working with Jeff Emerick and Peter Vince, who had engineered Sgt. Pepper. They were in very good hands, and the stage was set for something great. As promised, they produced the album themselves. Rod Argent and Chris White, the two primary songwriters of the Zombies, took the reins. They didn't bring in any outside musicians or big-name producers. They just went in, rehearsed like mad, and recorded the thing with the tightest budget you can imagine. And because of this tight budget, they couldn't afford to experiment endlessly in the studio. Everything had to be precise and efficient. So they rehearsed everything down to the last detail before setting foot in the studio. What you hear on Odessey and Oracle is essentially a collection of meticulously arranged live takes. We would put the whole track down within one traditional 3-hour session. We felt that we were getting the best sound that we'd had up to that time. It all felt very natural. No click tracks, no fancy studio tricks, just raw musicianship and harmonies they could actually replicate live. In fact, the budget was so tiny that when the label requested they change the recording to stereo from mono, the band ended up paying out of their own pocket to make those changes. Now, I have to mention the typo in the album title at this point. Odessey is spelt wrong. And no, it's not a deep metaphor or some psychedelic twist. The album's cover was hand-drawn by Terry Quirk, a friend of bassist and songwriter Chris White, and he just simply spelt it wrong. But instead of correcting it, they leaned into it. The whole album had this slightly off, enchanted psychedelic feel to it anyway, so a weird, whimsical misspelling on the cover was actually perfect. It kind of became a metaphor for the whole thing. Brilliant, strange, and totally out of step with what was popular at the time. They put their heart and soul into this album, and it worked. Care of Cell 44 opens the album with a jangly upbeat melody, and then you realise it's a love letter to someone in prison. It's a real lyrical whiplash compared to the tune. This is certainly an album you could call all killer, no filler. It's just stuffed with great tracks. Songs like A Rose for Emily and Brief Candles show off Chris White's more introspective writing.
Candles in her mind, bright and tiny gems of memory.
Meanwhile, Rod Argent shows off what he can do with Hung Up on a Dream and Changes.
I knew her when summer was her crown.
Every track has layers, not just musically, but emotionally. And then there's Butcher's Tale, Western Front 1914, sung by Chris White in a haunting, strained voice.
I have seen a friend of mine hang on the wire like some rag toy.
Despite this album being brilliant and now being hailed as a masterpiece, at the time, it was a flop. The album was released by CBS in the UK in April 1968, and it failed to make any sort of impact. After the single Care of Cell 44 failed to chart in the US, the record company decided not to release the album to the American market. Psychedelia was getting louder and wilder, and the Zombies were making quiet, intricate music with harpsichords and string quartets. The label just didn't believe it would land. And so it seemed the Zombies was over. But then their saviour came in the form of musician and producer Al Kooper. Now, Al Kooper was a big fan of the Zombies and quickly came to their rescue. While the US division of CBS passed on releasing it, he urged their subsidiary label, Date Records, to put it out. Look, I've picked up this album in England and you've got to acquire this album. I don't care who's got it and how much you have to pay. You have to acquire this album. And because he had some clout, they listened. They released the album in 1968. They also released Time of the Season as a single.
It's the time of the season.
And at first, same story. No one seemed to care. But then slowly, the single started catching on. DJs started playing it more, listeners started calling in, and it snowballed from there. Out of nowhere, it hit number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100, and suddenly the Zombies had a massive hit. But they didn't exist anymore. Yeah, that's right, with the disappointment of their magnum opus initially flopping, the band had split up. Suddenly, the record label was scrambling to get the band back together, but by then, the members had simply moved on. Colin Blunstone was working in an insurance office. Rod Argent was starting a new band, which funnily enough did go on to have some big hits, like Hold Your Head Up.
Hold your head up, hold your head up.
There were even a few fake zombies touring around America at the time pretending to be the real band. Seriously, it was that wild. Eventually, Blunstone would return to music. Argent's band, simply called Argent, would do well in the 70s. But Odessey and Oracle never got a proper tour or promotion from the original band. That is, until decades later. Over the years, the album's reputation kept growing. Musicians would cite it as secret influences. Record collectors would whisper about it like it was buried treasure. It took on an almost mythical quality. And slowly, the tide turned. Rolling Stone ranked it on their best albums of all time lists. Pitchfork called it one of the greatest psychedelic albums ever made. Musicians started shouting about it, with Paul Weller, Tom Petty and Dave Grohl singing its praises. Suddenly, this little forgotten album was being talked about in the same breath as other great 60s classics. And the fact that they broke up anyway. It's like the perfect tragic legend. They made their masterpiece and they walked away. In 2017, the surviving members of the Zombies reunited and played Odessey and Oracle in full for the first time ever. A record that barely sold 1,000 copies on first release was now a centerpiece of psychedelic rock history. Isn't that amazing? And I'm so glad it finally got the recognition it deserved. Sort of reminds me of when David Bowie made an entire album which got shelved and was never released until after he passed away. You can click over there if you fancy watching that one.